Thanks be to God.
God, speak to us through your word, speak to our pain, and speak to the hope that we have in you. As we already mentioned, today is the 75th anniversary of the Nagasaki bomb, and Hiroshima was 3 days ago. I confess that I had to go and do some research to educate myself on the reality of those historical tragedies. Now, I've heard of Hiroshima. It is the most famous in my side of the world, but I honestly haven't heard of Nagasaki. But hearing is one thing, and seeing is something else. And yet, living the experience is a whole other dimension. Earlier this week, I watched my beloved capital getting destroyed and burned. The streets that were once full of life and music, smiles and perfumes and selfies. Those streets and alleys I walked on my way to seminary or to have lunch with friends. Those seaside trails that we biked on weekends. Those buildings, those shops I watched burning, they're very real to me. And I know Hiroshima and Nagasaki are very real for many of you too, whose families lived in those towns. Humanity is a work in progress, it seems, even until this day. Friends, to be honest with you, I struggled to write a message of hope for today, because what I'm feeling is despair and deep, deep sadness. As I read the words of the scripture from 1 Kings, I couldn't help but notice the similarity between the imagery in this passage and the destructive forces of the ugly reality of our world. First, there is a wind so strong it splits mountain and breaks rocks into pieces. This is not a metaphor for a lot of us. I've seen this wind with my eyes, throwing people and cars and trees away and breaking warehouses and splitting the earth in two, literally. And then there's an earthquake, another imagery used by the author of 1 Kings, and also by everyone I talked to was within a 15-mile radius of the explosion. And there was a fire that consumed whatever the shockwave spared. Very powerful, but also violent images. Ironically, all of these images are regular Old Testament accompaniments of God's appearance. In Exodus, we read that Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire. And the book of Psalms will describe how the earth trembled and quaked and the foundations of the mountains shook from God's presence. But then it is intriguing in this passage that the author would go through the trouble of listing all of these elements that usually display or describe God's presence, and then would explicitly tell us that God was not in the wind, and God was not in the earthquake, and God was not in the fire. So I asked myself, what is the point that the author is trying to make? Up until this encounter, up until this passage, Elijah's life had been very stormy. To draw some background, in the preceding chapter, After escaping a famine and drought, Elijah had ordered to slaughter hundreds of the prophets of Baal in an attempt to cleanse the nation from the false prophets. And then the king's wife hears about it. She gets so furious and she orders to kill him. And now he's fleeing for his life. He leaves the kingdom, goes to the wilderness where he dismisses his servant so he can be left alone. There he pleads with God to take his life away. And he lays under a broom tree and just waits until his power just fades out. God talks to him, talks him out of it. But Elijah's depression just does not go away. So by the beginning of this passage, he found a cave where he's now hiding. So here's Elijah, who's experienced disappointment after threat, after danger, and now he's obviously depressed, refusing to eat, wishing to die. There are times when you've just had enough. When it has been storm after storm after storm after storm, and faced with such deep sadness, which one of us wouldn't run and find a cave to just hide in it? Who wouldn't surrender to depression and just wish to withdraw and give up? That's been the state of my people, even before the big catastrophe, for decades. I know it's the state of some of you listening to me today. And I know for some others, even if your life right now is not there, but you've experienced that, and that's just the memory of a historical bombing of entire cities with their citizens. It's just a painful one. And so we stand there watching fire and earthquake and wind just pass by and missing God in the scene. So there's Elijah standing there, waiting for God to pass him. But God was not in the wind that splits rocks. God was not in the earthquake that scares and terrifies. And God was not in the fire that burns mercilessly. But then a sound of sheer silence, or in Hebrew, stillness, announces the passing of the Lord. A stillness that shakes Elijah's presence harder than any wind or fire or quake. Friends, this image of God appearing in the calm after the storm to deal with Elijah's troubled soul is so powerful. God is active. God cares. God listens, speaks, and acts. And not only in obvious ways, but also in discreet and in the least expected ways. In the other scripture reading that we heard this morning, we see Peter, who, as per his habit, fervent, impatient, impulsive, and enthusiastic, cannot wait for Jesus to get to him, but instead asks if he can go to him. It doesn't matter that it seems logically impossible. If Jesus can do it, he can do it. Or can he? Like Elijah, Peter was too weary from a long night of wrestling against waves and wind in the disciples' boat when Jesus invited him to walk on the water. And he was tired. And even if he had the faith to do it, he wouldn't have had the energy to sustain him as he walks to meet his Lord. And as the wind blew, it scared him and he went back to his storm. Doesn't that describe most of our lives? Friends, storm and stillness seem to come together in one package. Elijah finally encountered God in the stillness after the storm. And all Peter needed to do is be still. My spiritual director told me the other day that sometimes God takes more time than we appreciate. And I also think that sometimes God is more silent or still than we appreciate or have patience for. Someone wrote about Lebanon on Facebook. A person of faith wrote that God is seeing what's happening and nothing happens without God's knowledge. And I just couldn't help but write a comment. Does God watch the news of Lebanon? Sometimes God is more still than we appreciate. Stillness is not a comfortable place to be. And silence is not always where God appears. There is a deadly silence. You know it. You've heard it. We've talked about it for 2 months on Tuesday nights. It is the deafening silence that follows an explosion or a bombing. It is the deadly silence of dust just falling back on earth. The screaming silence of destroyed and desolate streets. The sickening silence of the global conscience. But that is not the silence in which God is found. Where God finally meets us is in that deep silence of a downcast soul. It is in the stillness of a broken heart, in the sincerity of raw pain. It is in the stillness of a silent prayer of a mother, still waiting and hoping for her kid to come home after having heard a deafening explosion. Friends, God appears to our broken humanity and turns the stillness of our grieving world into a stillness of hearts that still believe and faith that still preaches hope. Into stillness of quiet nights in which mothers can watch their babies sleep in peace. Into a stillness of water that doesn't frighten sailors. Into a stillness of peace that is no longer disturbed by human acts against humans. Into a stillness of a world ruled by the spirit of love. Into a stillness of a humanity freed from greed and personal benefits, from longing to power and authority and money. Friends, at times like these, when we grieve our world as we remember the ugly war history, and as we still live some of it, as we grieve the harm of a global pandemic, as we grieve the loss of a beloved member of our church, and worry about others, and as we grieve the rest of the world, the rest of the countries that lie under so much misery that we cannot even imagine, we are invited to stillness. And in that stillness, God finds us. And hopefully we too.